In 1978, the Sloan Report introduced the interdisciplinary hexagon, a framework that organized the 6 distinct pillars of cognitive science. It attempted to unify psychology, linguistics, and neuroscience, yet remained a structurally fragmented enterprise, with each discipline operating within its own explanatory silo. These fields were bound by the assumption that the mind operates as a discrete Turing machine. A Turing machine is a mathematical model processing a sequence of symbols one at a time. This mechanical logic transformed the mind into a digital processor, mapping human thought directly onto the physical switches and dials of early computers. This sequential model, the von Neumann architecture, relies on the physical implementation of sequential logic. However, this structure creates an insurmountable thermal and bandwidth bottleneck. When modeling the density of human macro-consciousness, the sheer volume of sequential data transfers causes hardware to overheat and fail. By 2026, researchers project an architectural shift in hardware design. The realization is that classical silicon simply cannot scale to replicate the density and energy efficiency of organic neural networks. Two converging theories are driving this transition. Andy Clark's predictive processing models the brain as an engine that proactively minimizes uncertainty, while Hunt and Schooler's general resonance theory, or GRT, identifies physical vibration as the mechanism of conscious binding. This leads toward right brain computing, or RBC. This framework prioritizes parallel resonant processing and utilizes the Multicode 6.0 semantic framework to bridge the gap between biological and synthetic intelligence. Understanding intelligence requires abandoning platform-independent software models. True cognition is found in the biologically integrated, continuous physical phase transitions of matter. Douglas Hofstadter developed a functionalist model of the mind, arguing that intelligence is a platform-independent manipulation of formal symbols. In his view, the specific material doing the thinking matters less than the logical structure of the operations. He called this logical structure a strange loop. It occurs when navigating the levels of a hierarchy inevitably circles back to the starting point. Hofstadter posited that this self-referential loop is what allows an emergent sense of I to arise from inanimate matter. This architecture is built on Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Gödel proved that within any consistent mathematical system, there are true statements that the system's own rules can never prove, statements that essentially refer to their own unprovability. From the perspective of hard AI, any assumption that carbon-based tissue is superior to silicon is dismissed as biochauvinism. If a recursive feedback loop is maintained, the hardware material is considered irrelevant to the existence of intelligence. However, the physical symbol system hypothesis carries a critical flaw. It treats the mind as a mathematical abstraction, ignoring the physical constraints, the energetic costs, and the bodily embodiment an organism needs to survive in a chaotic environment. Strange loops provide a map for the abstract logic of self-awareness, but their detachment from physical constraints makes them mathematically incomplete for modeling real-world biology. To ground the mind in biology, Andy Clark introduced the concept of meat that predicts. He defines the brain not as a passive receiver of sensory data, but as a proactive engine designed to minimize uncertainty. This process is known as perceptual inference. Instead of seeing the world as it is, the brain generates a continuous, controlled hallucination based on its own internal models, anticipating sensory input before it even arrives. The brain governs anticipation using Bayesian probability, updating its hypothesis as new evidence becomes available. The brain constantly updates its priors, the P of H term, when encountering prediction errors from new sensory evidence, the E term. The internal model dynamically weights itself to reflect physical reality. This requires active inference. If the world doesn't match the brain's internal prediction, the organism physically manipulates its environment to force the sensory data to align with its expectations. This explains why we don't just stay in a dark, quiet room to avoid surprises. Biological agents must actively sample the environment as a field of affordances, opportunities for action, to constantly test and validate their Bayesian models. Cognition requires physical embodiment to take these sensory samples. This proves that the mind and physical action are an inseparable, integrated system. This constant cycle of predictive updates creates a physiological binding problem. We must explain how billions of spatially distributed Bayesian calculations fuse into a single, cohesive macro-conscious experience. Hunt and Schooler's general resonance theory, or GRT, provides the physical framework to solve this problem. The key is known as the coupling axiom. When proximate biological structures oscillate, they phase lock. They synchronize their vibrations, which allows the data bandwidth between those structures to increase exponentially. This biological synchronization relies on physical vibration, specifically electrochemical and electromagnetic resonance cascades, rather than the slow thermal pathways used by digital algorithms. Researchers use Koromoto-type phase reduction mathematics to model this resonance, a framework describing the collective behavior of coupled rhythmic oscillators. In this equation, the spatial phase gradient acts as a mathematical penalty, physically suppressing asynchronous neural firing, forcing the system toward global harmony. As the system relaxes toward a stable reference configuration, the biological matter undergoes a sudden phase transition, moving from chaos to unified coherence. This emergence is tracked by a global order parameter, RFT. This parameter functions as a fundamental emergent clock, coordinating the timing of cognitive processes across the entire cortex. Macro-consciousness manifests as a literal physical phase transition of biological matter reaching resonant coherence. Classical silicon logic gates cannot sustain these continuous resonance cascades. The rigid hardware design creates thermal and structural limits that prevent the fluid, synchronized oscillations necessary for organic-level processing. This structural limit has forced an architectural shift toward right-brain computing, prioritizing parallel, stochastic, and resonant processing modes over sequential code execution. This hardware utilizes new materials, such as aluminum scandium nitride artificial synapses, capable of ultra-fast polarization switching, alongside silicon photonics, to process information via light waves. These materials enable coherent Ising machines, or CIMs. These processors utilize nonlinear optical oscillations to map out and solve highly complex mathematical problems. This Hamiltonian energy function of the Ising model is used to find the absolute ground state of a problem. Instead of executing code, the optical hardware physically settles. It naturally slides down into the lowest energy well of the topographic landscape, instantly solving the equation. Right-brain computing achieves extreme efficiency by allowing the physical dynamics of the medium to become the computation itself, mirroring the mechanics of organic wetware. These theoretical models are now being validated by empirical data. In 2025, Stanford Medicine conducted clinical trials using a new generation of brain-computer interfaces. The trial used a 5-layer recurrent neural network to decode internal brainwave patterns. It successfully translated inner speech into phoning probabilities with 74% real-time accuracy. A phoneme is the smallest unit of sound that can distinguish one word from another in a language. The researchers discovered that this inner speech is robustly represented in the brain's motor areas, not just the regions associated with linguistic meaning. This discovery provides physical proof of Andy Clark's active inference model. It proves that internal thought acts as a predictive motor action, a literal movement of the mind. By treating thought as a predictive physical action, external hardware can map directly to human intentionality, bypassing the need for physical speech or movement entirely. In March 2026, researchers in Cambridge and the EPFL succeeded in creating artificial neurons that communicate bidirectionally with human brain tissue. These are not the passive, rigid electrodes used in the past. These organic nanowires are dynamic and chemically reactive, allowing them to integrate directly into the biological environment. To manage this symbiosis, engineers developed Multicode 6.0. This semantic framework unifies different levels of information, from rigid logic to fluid resonance, into a single control system. This convergence presents a severe ethical challenge. Resonant BCI networks completely bypass the biological firewall of physical autonomy and the privacy of the mind. As engineered systems gain the capacity for transpersonal neurological resonance, the need for strict regulatory frameworks becomes an urgent necessity. The final trajectory of cognitive science involves engineering active matter that seamlessly anticipates, phase locks, and resonates with human consciousness.